Cory is going to be speaking to us on the reality of a sustainable apiary, Varroa sensitive hygiene, and queen management. Tell you a little bit about Cory. He's been keeping bees for 14 years. He tends a 27-acre farm in Bloomfield, Missouri, which he manages for wildlife and pollinator habitat. Cory and his wife, Jamie, manage Stevens Bee Company with the help of their two children, Jade Olivia and Camden. You can check out Stevens Bee Company online at stevensbeeco.com or on Facebook. Cory is currently serving as president of Missouri State Beekeepers Association. He was certified as a master beekeeper by the Eastern Apiculture Society in 2013 and trained by Sue Covey in 2014 to instrumentally inseminate queens. He slips bees into random conversations with strangers and annoys his wife by constantly talking about bees. Cory is rounding third base, finishing up a MS in entomology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Cory, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm glad that you are able to share with us some information from your experience.
Certainly. I've got a fan going behind me. Is it annoying? Should I turn that off?
I cannot hear it. I'm going to give you screen sharing. I think you have it now. Hi, Cory.
Hello. Well, I would say if it starts to be an issue or anything, just let me know. I can kick it off real quick.
You're loud and clear.
Sweet. Well, how did you want to kick things off? You want me to go through my little selecting for VSH and honeybees and then take questions? I mean, I can take questions on the fly too.
Yeah, let's do your
clear on something.
Yeah, let's do your slides, and then if something gets really complex or questions become a little too quick for us to manage in the chat, we'll cue them toward the end and give about maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes to address some of those.
Sounds good.
All right, you running your PowerPoint, or am I bringing it up?
Let's see here. I think I've got it here. How's that look?
Yep, coming up.
Okay.
There it is.
All right. Minimize this thing here. Okay. I usually keep things fairly informal, so like I mentioned a bit ago, if I'm not clear on something or you've got a question in particular that relates to something I just talked about, if you want to just throw it in chat, James can field questions and we'll see where this leads. Okay, here we go. Let's figure out the controls here. I'll just skip through this. Most of you know Varroa mites. I kind of made the observation not too long ago that, oh my gosh, that's all I hear about with beekeeping is Varroa mites. If you're a beekeeper, you might be sick of hearing about this. 99% of the time, beekeepers can't have a meeting or even a conversation without saying the word mite or Varroa. Keep count sometime. There is a reason, of course, that we talk about it constantly. I mean, it's unanimously the #1 threat to honeybee health for a variety of reasons. Common knowledge here for the most part, but some may not realize that Varroa parasitize honeybees and they feed on their fat bodies, which depletes their energy stores and their hemolymph. Of course, they're going to open the bees up to viral and bacterial infections, unfortunately. And of course, this drastically affects colony survival. And they're such ridiculously important pollinators. I mean, our native bees are too, of course, but these are extremely important to our food supply here, so not good. Whenever I first started keeping bees, I had all your typical issues. You know, I would have withered wings from deformed wing virus, colonies that just looked rough, you know, poor winter survival, used to see chalk brood all the time, you know, various brood issues. And so I kind of got obsessive about mite and disease resistant traits that are naturally occurring in the honeybees. And I ran across this, I think it was a paper that John Harbaugh had written about SMR or VSH bees. Of course, the bees we keep haven't really, on an evolutionary scale, been exposed to Varroa mites very long. It didn't arrive in the States until around 1987. I saw, I think, one earlier account, but I don't know. I think everybody kind of just goes with 1987. It could have been here a bit sooner. But really, the European honeybees haven't been exposed to Varroa mites at least until the late 50s or early 60s. So on an evolutionary scale, you know, it's pretty new pest to the species. We knew it was really bad as soon as it got here. So around 95, they tasked a bee scientist at the USDA to breed a Varroa resistant bee. They found, I think they started with only like 13 colonies or so, but there were some that it was colonies that they thought displayed some type of mite resistance. It didn't specify what, but I think it was from multiple beekeepers. But they did find that some of the bees don't allow the mites to reproduce, which is kind of mind-blowing. They termed the phenomena or trait set, whatever they were calling it at the time, suppressed mite reproduction, which is, of course, kind of fitting. It's exactly what they're doing. Later, they changed SMR to VSH because I think it may have been Marla Spivak that figured out it was a hygienic mechanism, like they were throwing pupae out. Because at first I didn't know how they were doing that. So a lot of people hear a lot about it, or the term gets thrown around a lot, but I think some people don't exactly know what it is. It's a trait set, actually, so it's multiple genes that tell the bees what to do. It's an additive trait, so VSH isn't like, you know, Carniolan, Italian, Caucasian, then VSH. It's just a trait set, like it could be in any type of honeybee. It can be added to any type of honeybee. So, you know, you could have VSH Carnies, VSH Italians, whatever you're selecting it into. So it's an additive trait. It's a hygienic response, like I said earlier, but it's not like general hygiene where they freeze, you know, the freeze killed brood where they use liquid nitrogen or whatever to freeze a patch of brood and see how quick they can get rid of it or not, how good of housekeepers they are. This is very specific. So these bees it's an olfactory cue. So they're smelling the brood cells and they're specifically picking out brood cells that have a reproductive mite in it. So if there's a female mite in there and she doesn't have young or doesn't have babies, progeny, whatever you want to call them, they'll leave it alone. But if she's reproducing in there, they'll uncap it and throw it outside, which is amazing. Like I said before, they use olfactory cues, so they're smelling it like a hound dog. They're known for a high rate of uncapping and recapping. So this is a picture of one of my brood frames here. Some people call this bald brood, which kind of annoys me because it sounds like a brood disease. It's actually a genetic trait where they're uncapping and investigating these pupae. Now I'm sure there's some bees that have the uncapping portion of it, but maybe don't have recap or maybe aren't fully VSH, but this is generally an indicator. Like if you're looking for VSH colonies to test and you start seeing this, that's a possibility. I know some people think it's wax moths, and maybe that happens sometimes, but this is very early season and there are no wax moth larvae in there. So it's definitely not that. I've argued with people over that a few times. Matter of fact, you can see, well, maybe you can't see too well, but some of the times they'll kind of hump the rim up a little bit. So it almost looks like, you know, some people may think it's a laying worker. Because whenever I first started using VSH, I had grafted out of a breeder queen. And I was seeing this in one of my colonies, and it was a big colony and had big, nice sheets of brood. And I kept seeing that. I'm like, well, she's a drone layer. So I pinched her and flicked her because I was going to replace her with a new queen because I was had queens on a weekly basis. And then later that evening, I was looking at the USDA ARS website, and they had something posted which had pictures of VSH behavior, and it showed that exactly, and said sometimes the ram will be heaped up a little bit. And I was like, no, I just killed a high VSH expressing queen ignorantly. But now I know, and sometimes I learn best if it's painful. So after these bees detect a reproductive mite, like I said, they'll uncap it and remove the pupa. And this interrupts the mite's life cycle, because whenever they pull them out, the young mites aren't mature yet. They're not able to survive, in an environment that's where they're getting tossed about and whatnot. So it completely interrupts the mite's reproductive cycle and shuts it down. I know the previous speaker was talking about IPM, which is huge. I'm glad they touched on that. As James mentioned, I'll graduate in May. I'm finishing up a master's in entomology. And that's one thing that you get drilled in your head constantly is integrated pest management, which is an intelligent way to approach a pest problem, whether you're talking row crops, cattle, sheep, whatever, this applies. It's a multifaceted approach to managing pests. And first and foremost, you're sampling. He was talking about mite loads and what your average load is. And without that, people that are using miticides or whatever, just blanket treating them, you may not even need that. So you're exposing them to that. You're wasting resources and time and money for the treatments for nothing really. So this is a more intelligent approach. You're actually seeing if there is a problem first before you're going to try to do anything about it. So of course you have to establish a treatment threshold if you're planning on treating. And they're all over the place. I mean, I've heard some people, even smart people, say, even one you should treat. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's just insane, because you're going to constantly be doing that. And there's always trade-offs. If you're prophylactically using chemical applications, it doesn't matter if it's, soybean aphids and soybeans, or corn earworms and corn, or Varroa and honeybee colonies. Whatever chemical treatment you're using on them is a short-term trade-off. I mean, you'll fix the issue, but whenever you consistently keep using that stuff on them, they inevitably develop resistance. It's only a matter of time. And the more frequently you use it, the faster it happens. Nature always finds a way. So the holy grail of any IPM system is host resistance. If you don't have resistant stock, like I said, whether you're talking row crop or honeybees, you're going to be constantly stuck prophylactically treating everything, because it has no resistance mechanism. It's like sending soldiers into combat with purses instead of M4s, they're completely defenseless. Without host resistance, prophylactic chemical applications are the default. There's no way around it. And this is why I get stuck on VSH, or why I have been for over a decade, because it's hands down, irrefutably in my eyes and my studies, the most powerful genetic resistance mechanism that we're currently aware of. And it's multifaceted. So they're hygienic as well. So you don't see chalk brood. You have drastically lower mite levels because they don't allow them to reproduce, assuming you have high expressing VSH. So I know there's a lot of VSH that are sold that probably aren't high expressing, to where it may not even be worth the extra money. So all VSH are not created equal. What to expect? So a little bit about where I started. The first couple of years I did use chemical miticides because my bees looked rough. And I did a complete switch of my genetics. Like I kept a bunch of feral stock and I would catch swarms and all that stuff, but I kept VSH breeder queens on hand. Like I started off with Tom Glenn's VSH Italians. So this is one of the breeder queens that I inseminated here. I would just, whenever the timing was right, whenever the bees want to raise queens, I would raise queens consistently. And every time I would find a colony that looked crappy, you know, the brood pattern was rough or they're getting ate up with mites or whatever, I would just kill that queen and replace the genetics of that colony. You know, I wasn't blanket queening, but if anything had a problem, they got requeened. And it was like a 180-degree turn in my apiaries. Like whenever I started using VSH stock, I quit using any kind of chemical treatments because I wanted to see what they're actually capable of. You know, if it's snake oil or if it's actually something that works. And immediately, like my brood patterns got way better. Of course, I'm open mating VSH queens with Missouri mutts, you know, so they're not related. You're gonna have good brood patterns, good genetic diversity. My survival rate went through the roof. Like I quit having little dinky colonies that I was having to try to nurse back to health that inevitably didn't make it anyway. And weren't worth the time. This is probably the most drastic thing that I saw that is still stuck in my mind, and it's still applicable to this day. I've never had an exception to it. Whenever I would find a colony that had deformed wing virus to a high degree, if some of you aren't familiar with it, the bees' wings, the worker bees, their wings look like two little pieces of yarn. They can't fly, so they're completely a drag on the colony. They'll never forage, they'll never be productive. But I would find a colony that's has a lot of deformed wing virus in it and probably a high mite load. I didn't treat them. I would just requeen with a VSH F1 queen, and within 6 weeks you would go back and look and there's no deformed wing virus that I could see. You know, it had completely cleared up.
Hey, Cory.
So that, yes.
Could you clarify what an F1 queen is for folks?
Sure. Yep. If you have, like in this case, this breeder queen here, you can see the number blue disc on her back. She was instrumentally inseminated. So I know that her mom, anything that she was mated with was VSH, and she's also VSH. And so that I know that all the workers are going to carry it, and for sure all the drones are going to carry it. Well, if you raise daughter queens out of her, those are F1 or like a first generation queen. If you raised a daughter out of her and then made daughters out of this one, those would be F2s. And if you grafted out of them, F3s, F4s, etc. Good question. So I knew they were high expressing VSH queens, and they were open mated with Missouri mutts. But immediately, and I still don't see deformed wing virus in my apiaries, pretty much period, in drones or workers, after I started using high VSH stock. Drastic reduction in brood diseases. I haven't seen one single cell of chalk brood since I started using them, you know, over a decade ago. Significantly lower mite loads. It's not like VSH bees won't get mites. You know, however they pick them up, they'll bring them home, but they're just not letting them reproduce. So you may have some to where their mite loads start to climb a bit if they're robbing or whatever's going on. But inevitably, they'll die off. They can't reproduce, especially, you know, late season, it may climb, but in the spring, it's difficult to find mites in samples whenever I'm testing breeding candidates, and they had never been treated either. So uncapping, recapping, like I showed you a picture of on the last slide, I believe. And a lot of them will work over drone brood just like they will worker brood, which is cool because the assays are always done. Like if you're testing to see how high a VSH a colony is, it's done in worker brood. And I know some people have asked why they don't do it in drone brood. I don't know. You possibly could, but a lot of the ones I see work drones over just as much or more than workers, so that's cool. This, remember I said that I would replace the queen in a colony that had deformed wing virus with a VSH-F1, and then I would come back later and see if, see that it's been cleaned up, which I didn't know exactly what was going on. I just knew they had some kind of viral resistance mechanism. Well, it was kind of cool too, because Randy Oliver wanted people to send him samples from their apiaries. They were going to test for deformed wing virus, like all 3 types, A, B, and C strain. And so I think he specifically, it's been several years, but I think he specifically asked for treatment-free apiaries to send a sample. And I'm assuming it's so they could go, oh my God, look how ate up they are with deformed wing virus. But anyway, I sent him samples and I'd almost forgotten about it. And I get an email from a grad student at the University of Salford, Manchester. So Randy, I sent the samples to Randy and Randy sent them to the UK. The deformed wing viral analysis, well, I think it was mostly VSH-F1 queens. It should have been predominantly, but it wasn't my untreated apiary. And despite being touched by miticides for years, the total infection was extremely low. And I just took a little snapshot out of the email. And if you see here where I highlighted it, samples which were extremely low in deformed wing virus fell outside the quantifiable. So they could tell it was there, but it was extremely low. So they marked those as BL, below quantifiable levels. Well, this is my score apiary result. If you look down here, type A deformed wing virus, BL, below quantifiable levels, type B, BL, below quantifiable levels, and type C, they couldn't find it at all. It was non-existent. So what exactly or how they were doing that? I think they throw high viral load pupae outside. I think that's the most straightforward. And I've read a scientific paper where they said they would throw out pupae that had high Varroa destructor virus, but it said, but not deformed wing virus. They don't throw that out. And so I think that's incorrect, but I'm gonna have to do some further study on that. It's something's going on here because I'm not using miticides or anything and they're completely stamping it out. And as you can see here, it's not just speculation. There's some scientific data to back that up. If you want to test your own bees for VSH, or you buy a VSH from someone, you want to see if it's actually VSH or not. Here's how you do it. It doesn't take a whole lot. A pair of fine forceps, a magnification device. Like I got this at Home Depot or something. It's just, well, you can see Erin, this is my friend Erin here. She came down to help test. It's an LED halo and it's got a little magnifier on it so you can see what you're doing. And these are grafting frames, just to hold a deep, or it'll hold a medium too. And you can graft out of it and you can't see it, but down here, there's a spot where you put your bar and graft into it. And that works out well because you've got to pull out at least 100 pupae. And I put them like in little piles of 5 and you can count them that way. So, of course, supplemental lighting so you can see what you're doing. You're going to want a frame of brood from which colony you're wanting to test, where they're mature or they're starting to emerge. That's the grafting frame holder. It's handy, not necessary, but it's pretty handy. And then a simple record sheet.
Hey, Cory.
Yes.
So before we get too far from it, I figured we'd just jump in and grab it since
go for it.
Like to go on the fly here.
I do.
Mary Jarvis is asking if you could give an explanation on type A, B, and C deformed wing viruses.
Okay, it's just variants. Like, you know how there was COVID variants where there's slight genetic mutations, it's a little bit different. That's the way it is with A, B, and C type. They're still deformed wing virus, but they're not exactly the same genetically. So they just called them A, B, and C strain. It's 3 separate strains of the same virus. It's a good question. Did that cover it for you, or would you like to know a bit more?
I feel it was sufficient.
Okay. Have you got some more questions, or should I roll for?
Roll forward, because I'm going to really slam you at the end.
Perfect. And feel free to jump in too. Like if you've got a question that's pertinent, don't hold back.
You got it.
All right. All colonies that you're wanting to test, like we test big batches of colonies at the same time. And so you can see this right down here. I put a little tree tag. It's a stamp, it has an individual, it's got a number on it. I think I bought like 1 through 500 or 1 through 1,000 or something like that. So every colony has its own number. And whenever we find the frame we want, we'll just write the colony number on top of the frame so we know who it is that we're scoring. The queens need to be laying in the colonies for at least 6 weeks to get an accurate score. So it's her bees, there's a certain age of worker bees that do the VSH duties, if you will. And so you want to make sure that it's her daughters, of course. So you got to leave her in there at least 6 weeks. Test colonies are inspected to find brood frames suitable for testing, which is emerging workers. You want them multiple reasons. A, they're easier to pull out, and B, you want to give those Varroa every possible chance to reproduce so you get an accurate score. An ideal age pupa, how you'll see white or purple-eyed, those are not quite there yet. You want them to at least be starting to pigment a bit, start to turn tan, or be starting to emerge. Those will work too. Like I said before, mark the frame with the colony number and put it in a nuke box, brush all the bees off so that my wife pictured here isn't mad that I'm taking a bunch of bees inside. And then you can transport them to the lab. I usually brush them again because you'll have little nurse bees that are still coming out. Brush it in before you take it inside. This is what you're looking for. There's a female mite, mama mite. There's daughter, brand new daughter. She still doesn't even have pigment yet. Here's a male. Here's another male. So that's a reproductive mite. Like I said before, these aren't quite old enough. They're hard to pull out. You want them to at least start to have a little bit of pigment to them, be this age here or older. This is Erin doing a VSH assay. She's quick. Okay, you want to remove at least 100 pupa. Usually 100's enough to get a score. And all you do is just pierce the cap and make sure it's old enough, and then pull the pupae out and look on the actual pupae to see if there's a reproductive mite or a mite, and then look down into the cell you pulled it out of too. The simple record sheet, I usually just put the colony number, and then you want to record how many non-reproductive female mites you find and how many reproductive female mites that you find. And this just shows you how to score it. This is, I'll list it here at the end of the presentation, but it's all the instructions are on John Harbaugh's website. He's the godfather of VSH. He's the scientist that figured it out. And he just openly shares how to score, which is awesome. If you find 5 or more reproductive mites in a 100 pupae sample, there's no measurable VSH. If you find 3 to 4 reproductive mites in 100 pupae, you get a score of 1. So it's 20 to 30% VSH, which is not very much really, because I think he said upwards of 15% of mites don't reproduce just naturally, even in non-VSH colonies. So there's like maybe a tiny bit. Now, if you find 1 or 2 reproductive mites in 100, your colony gets a score of 2. Now you're starting to get a little bit of measurable VSH in there. If you find 0, out of 100, or one reproductive mite out of 200. Like you didn't find anything in 100, so you go ahead and double the sample size and you found one, the colony gets a score of 3. That's still not bad. 50 to 80% VSH. There's some measurable, they're stopping some level of mite reproduction. And if you find 0 reproductive mites out of a 200 sample, or you just find 5 non-reproductive mites, so you keep finding mites, but none of them are reproductive, that's 100%, 80 to 100% VSH expression. So they allowed 0 mite reproduction. And that's what I require all my breeders to be. I don't want them to allow any reproduction, because I know people are going to graft out of them, you know, and you'll have F1s and F2s, and it might start them muddy a little bit. So I want them to start off extremely resistant. Applying your VSH scores. So like I said before, everything's got a number, so you know what each colony scored. If the colony scores 0, they have no VSH alleles. So alleles are like the genes, basically. And I said before, it's multi-trait that make up VSH. It's not just one, it's a little trait set. So if a colony scores 0, they have no VSH alleles. If a colony scores 4, it suggests the bees have all the alleles needed for VSH. So they're going to be ridiculously mite resistant. And then the colony score, you use that to evaluate both, you know, if you're doing instrumental insemination or whatever in a breeding operation, you know, those colonies that score high, you want to graft out of them. And even if it's an F1, you know, you can use the drones out of it, and they're still going to be pure VSH. That's kind of a cool thing. If you use a VSH breeder and she's a 4, even if you open mate your queens to Missouri Muttleys or Michigan Muttleys that aren't VSH, 100% of the drones that those F1 queens produce will be pure VSH, which is kind of cool. But they don't have a dad. They only have a granddad, so it really doesn't matter what they mated with, if that makes sense to you. The score is permanent. As long as that queen's alive, it stays with her. And of course, you should prioritize your most mite resistant colonies for drone and queen production. Of course. This is probably my favorite topic of beekeeping. I love queen rearing. It took my beekeeping operation from an expensive hobby to actually making a little bit of money, to where my wife wasn't quite as critical. Of course, you want to raise queens from your highest VSH scoring colonies. That's what you're selecting for. High scoring colonies should also be used for drone production. And we asked earlier what an F1 queen is. That's the first generation from your breeder. Requeen susceptible colonies with F1 queens from your high VSH colonies. So actually, you're just constantly, you know, I'm not saying kill everybody and replace them all. Don't fix it if it's not broken, but as soon as you see an issue, requeen it. Anytime you're making new splits, you know, for increase or sale, obviously, you know, high mite resistant colonies are going to be what you want. And this is definitely not for everybody, and it's not necessary to keep it in a population, especially if you're testing for it. And if you're really wanting to select some traits like instrumental insemination, just cuts through the fog. Of course, you can make your bees way better, or you can make them way worse. It just depends on your skill as a breeder. There is no substitute for open mating. Okay, now we're getting to the fun part. That's my presentation. Here's a couple things you can look at here. My email, if you got questions or want to contact me, stevensvico@gmail. I have a little YouTube channel. It's not big yet, but I'm adding a lot more content to it. Got some more interviews scheduled, so you might find that interesting. Stevens Vico on YouTube. check out my website, stevensbeeco.com. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. So you can hit me up there too if you've got questions. So, James.
Did you say that the YouTube channel would be available as soon as you you finish developing your paid subscriber content structure?
That's a good question. It's actually out there for free right now.
Okay, so it's free. Well, good. Take advantage.
Yeah, take full advantage. I hope you enjoy it.
And download all the videos that you can right now.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. I've added several lately, and I've got some more interesting interviews coming up. So if you want to keep an eye on it, you might find it useful. If you're into queen rearing, bee breeding, or just beekeeping in general, I've talked to a few scientists. I've talked to just people that are doing it, that are in the field, beekeepers, commercial beekeeper. Troy Hall, I spoke with him. He was treatment free for quite some time. I think he had a rough year this last year, but I'm going to do a follow-up talk with him too. But anyhow, yeah, hopefully you'll find it useful.
I have quite a list of questions for you, some really good ones.
Okay.
So,
here.
100 of them are from Jeff. I'm just kidding.
I was going to say real quick here too, if you want to measure your own VSH, I gave you a quick rundown, and I actually have a video of me narrating this particular presentation on my YouTube channel that tells you how to VSH test. But if you want to go right to Harbo Bee Company, John Harbo, the godfather of VSH, he tells you straight out how to measure it. So there's his website there. If you just Google Harbo Bee Company, click on VSH, and then click on measure VSH, you can find it.
So one of the questions for you, Cory, is do you have any tips on preventing inbreeding and keeping hybrid bees going for those that are beekeeping with less than 50 colonies?
Yeah, I think I would start off by saying everybody freaks out over inbreeding, and most people are freaking out for no reason. Like, you really have to work hard to get inbreeding. So especially if you're grafting out of open mated stuff, you don't have to worry about it. If you're doing instrumental insemination, you can get your genetics a little bit narrow if you don't watch it. But I use a Page Laidlaw closed population breeding model. So I'm trying to keep as much diversity in that population as I possibly can, so that inbreeding is not an issue. So a lot of the breeder queens that I use are technically super mated, like how a queen will mate with 15 or 20 drones. I catch out of a whole yard of high tested colonies, and then I mix them up in a drone cage, so they may actually mate with 100+ drones. So yeah, and like I said, if you're grafting out of open mated stuff, you're gonna have to work hard to get inbreeding.
Jeff said that I was exaggerating. It was only 99 questions, so forgive me for my mistake. I'm not really good at counting. Should I change where I get a VSH breeder queen each year, or will they be different enough that I can get them from the same breeder?
I mean, I can't speak for other breeders. Mine would definitely be different enough. Like I said, I keep so much diversity in my population. I don't know exactly what other breeders are doing. And some people maybe even, start using single drone inseminations, which is a technique like to isolate traits out of a random population so that you can isolate it quickly. You would get narrow on those, but I don't know, like I said, I don't know what other breeders are doing. Technically, you'd just have to kind of ask them that question. But if you were buying breeders from me, you wouldn't have to worry about them being too closely related, for certain.
To improve the competency level of, let's say, a novice or a new beekeeper who's like, okay, this sounds great, I want to go ahead and venture off into the world of VSH, and I want to go ahead and try to implement this in my own apiary. What kinds of questions should somebody ask a supplier or breeder to know that they're what they're buying, and they can know that they're getting good quality queens?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it depends on where you're at. If you're way up north in Michigan, you'd probably want to ask them, about how conservative are they with stores, things that are kind of relevant to your area. I mean, if you're specifically buying VSH queens, I would kind of want to know how the parent stock scores, because I've bought instrumentally inseminated breeders that weren't fours, but they call them a VSH. It was like a 3, which 3 is not bad. Maybe I have too high of tolerances there, but like I said, I'm planning on people grafting out of it, probably grafting out of their daughters too, so I want them to start off with something that's extremely high. But I would say but what's better than asking somebody else, like, hey, how VSH are your bees? Most of them won't have a clue, probably. Just like I said before, testing them is not that hard. So if you buy a breeder or you're buying supposed VSH open mated, I would test them myself rather than taking somebody's word for it, But I mean, there's a ton of honest beekeepers out there. There's a few that, you know what I mean, a few rotten apples. And it's not like my bees will never die and they're the best bees in the entire world. I mean, it doesn't matter how Varroa resistant your bees are, they can still get sprayed, they can still starve to death, they could still die from beekeeper bumblings and doing the wrong things at the wrong times. I mean, there's still bees. I can just guarantee that mine are extremely mite resistant, but they're generally pretty conservative on stores too, even the Italians. Some people like to paint, like Italians are with a broad brush stroke. Italians will starve to death. Carniolans never will. I mean, you can't do that. I mean, there's so much variation between each species even that it's almost a waste of air to even say things like that. Although historically, I understand why people say that. Like, there's a lot of commercial Italians that just eat constantly and rear brood constantly. But there's a bunch of them, of Italians, that you don't even hardly have to feed because they're actually conservative. So, I've seen it with my own eyes. Anyway.
So does that mean I should cancel my package of 3-banded Italians?
Maybe not. I don't know. You just have to see how they do. I mean, some of the best bees I had came from freaking California. You know what I mean? That's what I'm saying. You can't paint it with a broad brush stroke. I had some really good bees that came out of Arkansas that were just open mated, hardy commercial stock. And then those bees that came from Tom Glenn that were instrumentally inseminated VSH Italians were rock solid. I mean, you couldn't hardly kill them, especially if you open mated them, with your local muttleys that are pretty sturdy. But you just have to try it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So Terry Combs has a question for you. He wants to know, I think you had alluded to this when you'd sent some of your stuff off for testing, but he wanted to know if you're able to produce some of the records concerning your test results and pedigree that kind of substantiate your claims.
The only thing I have is just VSH testing data. I don't try to keep a pedigree. I don't try to, like if you look at John Harbaugh's website, he says he doesn't select for color. So basically he doesn't care if it's called an Italian, he doesn't care if it's called a Carniolan. He cares how mite resistant it is. And really that's I've fallen into that camp. Like I was really in love with blonde ladies for a while, loved the big bootied blondes, big queens. But on the flip side, I've had some killer dark bees too. So I don't really try to keep a pedigree per se. I try to keep ridiculously high VSH so I know they're mite resistant. And I want them to be hardy. I want them to actually produce honey, because if they're commercially worthless, then the commercial side of the industry is never going to buy into resistant stock and things of that nature. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. Like if that's what you're into, if you're wanting to have a pristine looking VSH Italian where they're all blonde and uniformly colored, Like there's nothing wrong with that. That's really cool. I just haven't gone down that path necessarily. I'm more so concerned with hardiness, productivity, extreme mite resistance, that along those lines.
So to substantiate your proof, you have, obviously you have the assays and documentation records you're keeping concerning that. You also
Yes.
have the test results from sending them off concerning the nosema and the brood disease resistance that was verified.
Right. And,
which university was that? I think it was
University of, I think it was Salford, Manchester. I'd have to go back and look at that. Is this recorded? I think it is, isn't it? We can go back and look at it. It says it on that slide. But yeah, and I don't just test it myself and say, here's what they all test. Like I have people come in, most of them are friends. I'm assuming, ideally you would have a third party come in and test it, but I don't know any third parties that are doing VSH assays. So again, don't take my word for it. If you buy some of my queens, test them yourself and see what they're testing. They're going to be extremely high. The only ones like John Harbaugh, everything I've tested of his are 4s all day long. So like there is 0% mite reproduction in his. They're phenomenal. And all of mine, 100% of my breeders last year were all 4s. And the vast majority of my F1s, which is open mated, it was open mated in my apiaries. But we found out of the first sample, there's like 25 colonies we tested. We found 1 reproductive mite. So there was 1-3 in the group, but everybody else completely shut down mite reproduction.
Temperament. What kind of temperament are you seeing across your apiaries? Are they similar, consistent? Do they vary based on, the breeding with the mutts?
It's overall, it's pretty good. Like I feel like it's been, I don't want to say a roller coaster ride, but I've had variation. Like whenever I was using Tom's stock, I never wore gloves. I would just have a veil on. They're super chill bees, very productive. But like I said too, I like to bring in stock to test, and like I'll make a hybrid. Like I wanted to make a VSH and a aloe groomer hybrid. And so I had some Purdue stock and I crossed those with my really nice, beautiful VSH Italians, and some of them were Satan spawn. So it's weird, like if you make a cross of 2 completely unrelated bees, it seems like you'll, for some reason, have some aggression in it. And so I'm not making any really random crosses. I take that back. I've got a couple experimental ones out there, but I won't sell out of it. So I'm beating around the bush here. Let me cut to the chase. Now I don't wear gloves anymore. I've got that extreme aggression out. I would say they're fairly mild. It's not like some of the bees that like seem like they have 0 defensive instinct. I'm not there, but I don't wear gloves, unless it's like really overcast or whatever. If I'm pulling queen cells, and there's a storm moving in, like, you're not going to be able to go out there in a tank top and flip flops. You're probably going to have a couple bees on you, but they're not going to follow you or anything, like extreme aggression. So overall, they're pretty good. I don't really wear gloves anymore.
So if you get popped, you're not going to get lynched immediately.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're pretty good, and I'll keep working on that. Now that I'm doing my own VSH testing, there for a while I wasn't confident that I was keeping high levels because I didn't know. I wasn't testing. You don't know until you actually test it. So I would keep bringing in breeder queens and stuff. And I actually think there were several times I was degrading what I already had, but I wanted to keep that VSH expression so high. But I started testing a couple of years ago, and now I don't feel like I need to be bringing in stock constantly, so I can let the model work. Nothing's treated. So the breeders aren't treated. The open mated queens aren't treated. I keep less than 200 colonies. I've got enough to top out around 200, but I'm not big enough to just neatly separate everything out. So everything's pretty much a test colony. So it all gets treated the same.
So what is
treated the same.
what is your position then on let's say treatments on queens that you're breeding, or maybe you've gotten feedback from others who have used your stock and are using them in a treated apiary? Do you
Yeah.
and a lot of queens that are available locally will be billed as VSH queens, and this is kind of a vetting process for those that are listening. When you're buying a VSH queen, it can be billed as such. And one of the questions you should ask is, well, where did you breed that queen from?
Yep.
And where did you get the queen mother for that line? And how frequently are you breeding from that line? Because they may
Yep.
have come from VSH at some point, but you're looking at dilution of the genetic set 10 generations from then. You may not
Yep.
have the characteristics you're hoping or looking for, and end up with a dead colony because you treated that colony as though it were VSH. So
Yep.
they could also be coming from treated stock and not necessarily VSH at all because they were once associated with the VSH queen. So the question for you, Cory, is what effects can treatment have on impacting VSH traits?
I don't know that the treatments affect the traits per se because it's genetic. I mean, unless you were altering DNA with treatments, and dear God, don't use those. You know what I mean? But I would say the number one thing is if you're treating, you can't see what level of VSH expression there is. Because if I just used something that had high efficacy, I hit them with Amitraz or something and knocked all the mites out of it, and then I VSH tested them, well, it would look like they were testing high because there was no reproductive mites. But that's a lie. It's incorrect data. So that would be my number one caution is if you're planning to score them, as soon as you start putting the caricides or miticides in there, you've pulled a veil over your eyes. You can't see clearly, as to what's going on or what they're actually scoring. That would be my only caution. But as far as, I've got several commercial guys that are running my stock now. I'm sure they're treating, that's typically what they do. But hopefully, one of them I'm going to talk to here pretty soon. He bought multiple, which his dad was a beekeeper. So he's got the nostalgia, and his dad was working towards being treatment free. He was wanting to breed better bees, and then he unexpectedly passed away. And so now he's stepping up and carrying the torch, and that's why he was kind of interested in me. He wants to get back towards those better genetics where he can get away from it, and only treat if needed. So that's the direction that all of us should be pointing in, and is just having better bees where we're not so reliant on that. But did I answer your question? I feel like I'm wandering astray here, James.
No, you did fine. It's fantastic. It helps clarify some of the things that most folks aren't hearing. And, obviously the Bee Guild, what we're looking for is providing an alternative education where the primary thing you're learning is not just about, treating for mites. We're looking to offer alternatives to the education that's available. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about today, throughout the conferences, there are things that are acquired along the way, but they're not some of the first things that you hear. And I think that there's a significant deficit in that. I'm not really going to knock somebody for treating. I may not treat bees myself. And if you want to utilize, VSH and IPM methods in your apiary, again, we're going to encourage you to do those things that are going to benefit you and raising your stock and your queens, because nobody wants to lose bees. It's not something that we desire to do. But our desire is to have better bred bees, and doing that requires us to work together and to have this information available to us.
The dead bees aren't worth much, James.
No.
I haven't found a market for dead bees yet. And the thing is, until you can actually breed for resistance, it's hard to get away from that. I think there's a lot of commercial guys that, I don't think anybody loves using miticides. It's not like they're, hanging them around their house because they love the smell of it or they want to be exposed to it. It's an economical decision. So until you have measurable results, that's why I'm saying don't take my word for it or don't take somebody else's word for it. Figure out how to do a VSH assay and test it yourself. Then you'll know. And until you have measurable mite resistance, it's hard to get your hand on it, you know what I mean? And like, and then you have open mating too, which is a beautiful thing because you add genetic diversity to your colonies, but you're also selecting away from certain things. You know, it's difficult. It's hard to grasp, but if you're constantly measuring that, you know what you're at, and then you can work towards that goal. But if you're not measuring it, you know what I mean? Which I'm not saying there's no utility in that. Like I talked to John Keepus recently, that latest podcast that I did, and he wasn't really worried about how they survived, just that they survived. And so there's some utility in that because you might come up with another trait we're not yet aware of. You know, it's not like we have it all figured out by any means. But that's why I said VSH is the strongest resistant traits that we know of currently, because tomorrow somebody may figure out something else that's more cool, you know. But for right now, that's the most powerful and the most effective. That's why I've been hung up on it. But I think most people would agree. You know, I've heard Terry Combs talk, and he nails like his title of what he spoke about today: natural selection. That's it. I mean, until you have natural selection back in the breeding process, you're breeding something that's just unfit for survival, first and foremost. It's almost like the universe hates what you've created and seeks to destroy it. You know, you need to get in line with what's going on. And so putting natural selection first and foremost, where it weeds out some of the chaff, and that's what I'm doing. Natural selection first, put it at its rightful place, and then master beekeeper preference. Like those are super nasty, mean. I'm going to keep those out of the gene pool, you know. And then the very last thing I do is VSH. And so I know that, hey, Mother Nature deemed it okay, you know, it's useful stock. I like it. I like to work them. I like the way they look, whatever. And then I check VSH too, so that I know.
So that leads to another question that I have for you, and I want you to give me a bird's eye view of what you think, if you can. When I first started beekeeping, I had 2 hives, and I had 2 colonies, and you know, I caught a swarm or 2 that were probably less than desirable, and they were late summer swarms, and they were doomed from the get-go, to be honest with you. But the 2 colonies that I started with were, you know, there was a lot of hope, and there was a lot of fantasy that they would survive the winter, you know, based on what I was doing in my first year, and it was an epic fail. And you know, I learned a lot of things from that experience, and I was grateful for the experience. And I can't say that I feel good when a colony perishes, but at the same time, I look at the big picture and I think about what it is that I'm trying to accomplish through these processes. And as long as it's within the trajectory that I'm aiming for, losses are acceptable in that regard. But if it's just willy-nilly and it's not directed and there's no purpose in it, that's when I think it kind of changes the schema.
Absolutely.
And so in your perspective, like what would it look like for somebody who's only running like those 1 or 2 colonies, maybe 5 colonies at best, in a hobbyist way to scale, you know, a VSH apiary and integrating VSH and then maintaining that over the long haul? Is that even plausible?
You know, I mean, the same scenarios apply. You know, if you can figure out how to make a split or to where you can reliably catch swarms and kind of increase, because you're going to have colonies drop off. You know, sustainability is a big thing, you know, and that's just, to me, not having to constantly buy bees. So if you can take advantage of your colonies wanting to swarm, you know, and splitting them and having a few on hand, I think it's difficult to be totally sustainable with just a couple colonies. It's not difficult, actually. If you nail it, you can. But as far as selecting for certain traits, that's going to be difficult. Honestly, I would say support, if you've got somebody breeding locally, you know, like that's carrying VSH or has daughters of VSH queens and they're doing really well in their area and they're sturdy and rock solid. You know, I would advise maybe making a split out of each of your colonies and starting them and see if they work out okay. And then if this one goes down, you can put the nuke in here. You know, it's constantly I almost look at it like an accordion. You know, whenever you expand it out, you're making splits, so you're getting your numbers up. Some of them won't open mate. You know, who knows what happened to them? The bees killed them or whatever. So you're down a little bit. Then you'll have a larger colony that goes queenless or something's wrong. Well, it's okay. You can take your nuke and put it in the colony and you're back in business. Now you're a little bit, you know what I mean? You're contracting. But then in the springtime, which goes back into supporting local breeders or buying stock from somebody that's actually selecting for it, if you've just got a few, and then make some splits, you know, then you start the process over again. Some of them will fly off and get lost, or a bird will eat them, you know, and then you start contracting throughout the year. Then winter will take a few. Being able to weather storms, so to speak, is very important in sustainability. But as far as being able to breed your own type of bee or select for traits, you can test them and see what they look like, you know, and you can even raise queens out of 1 or 2 colonies. But it could be difficult to really fix certain traits, you know, with 1 or 2 colonies.
I think that, you know, to let the rest of the attendees know that if you stick around for Terry's talk tonight, he's going to give us some interesting information about those practical applications for smaller apiaries, and doing selective type things, and having those consistent characteristics that you're looking for. And Cory's right, you know, we can't all get fancy equipment and sit around and play with queens and all the other ooey gooey stuff that goes along with the artificial insemination. It takes a special type to do that. Sorry, Cory, but yeah, you're the special
okay.
type.
I've gone off the deep end. I understand. I'm kind of a freak of nature, and I don't advise it for everybody. It's not like I found the way, you know what I mean? Like, it's a useful tool, but it's not like everybody needs to be doing that.
Two quick ones for you. Your queens are a good starting point for a lot of people, and you have some recommendations on your website on how to get your virgins into their apiaries, and then you recommend that they mate with local stock. So they're acquiring some of the characteristics from your local area, where bees have adapted and adjusted to climate and to forage blooms and nectar availability, things of that sort. So that's one thing you can check out on his website. This one's simple.
And to piggyback on that, you're exactly right. Get a breeder queen and raise a bunch of virgins, open mate them locally, pick from the best and raise from those. So then you're getting your own locally adapted mix. And then, you know, like, I've got videos on how to select for VSH too. So if you want to test those colonies, here's how I think we win the battle. It's not one dude like me having the magic bullet and it's for sale and here's the low price that you can get it at. That's not it. Get stock from somebody who's selecting, learn how to raise queens, again, be able to make splits and be sustainable, test them, pick from the best, and then you have your own unique blend. So what I like to say is, if we're going to win the war on Varroa, it's going to be a small army of queen breeders and queen producers. So it's not just me, it's not just John Harbaugh or VP or Latshaw or anybody that's doing this, but teaching a man to fish, so to speak, rather than selling him a fish, if that makes sense.
No, that's exactly what we're hoping for with the Beekeepers Guild. That's one of our primary motives. So this is an easy one for you. What's the magnification on the light that you use, and where did you get your light particularly?
Oh, for the VSH testing?
Yep.
I'm thinking it's like 4x. One of them has 2 lenses, but it's like a desk lamp. You can find them at Home Depot. I'm sure Amazon and places you can find it too. I'm thinking it was 4x, you know, but my eyes are pretty good. Although, you know, I've hit the 4.0 mark, so I can tell they're starting to give a little bit, but I've always had really good vision. You know, if your vision's not as good, you may actually have to get something that's a bit stronger. But I think 4 to 6x, if I'm not mistaken, is where those are. And you can see pretty good.
How do your VSH mutt crosses score on the VSH assay? Do you see a big drop?
Ridiculously high. But the thing is the only ones that I VSH assayed open mated in my apiary. and almost all of my colonies are producing 100% VSH drones. So that's kind of cheating. As far as data, like on F1s, F2s, F3s, and remote areas, I don't have data on that. I would like to, I'd like to collaborate with somebody maybe and test that. But all my open mated queens are testing, basically fours. There was only one out of that first group of 20 something that actually had a reproductive mite in it. Everybody else is clean. So good question though.
Cory, thank you so much. You've been fantastic. I appreciate you coming on board for us today, sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate you being available for people when they have questions as well. And your participation in the Facebook group is also very helpful. It gives people hope and it encourages others that this is plausible.
Good.
Even if we have to scale down a little bit, we might not achieve, such high VSH numbers, because like you said, you kind of got the cheat codes with the prevalence of the genetics in your current apiary.
Sure.
But you built up to that. You started somewhere and you worked your way to that, and your trajectory and your goals started to line up. And that's got to be part of the plan. So.
And queen rearing, I encourage anyone out there that isn't familiar with it to start doing that. Like I said, if you can produce your own queens, that's a first massive leap to sustainability. And I don't have a giant operation, 100 to 200 colonies, but we reliably produce 2,000 queens a year in the spring, not open mated. I'm not having a bazillion baby nukes sitting around, but I can crank out 2,000 plus queen cells or virgin queens out of that reliably and produce breeder queens. So, it's totally doable. But thanks for the opportunity to speak. I enjoyed it. And you've got my email address and whatnot. Check out my website. And if you got questions, just shoot me a text or shoot me an email.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. So I pressed record on your presentation. So you cool. I'm just going to go ahead and post this in Stepler's page right away.
Go for it.
All right, man. Take it easy. We'll see you soon.
Thanks again. We'll see you all.
All right. So let me finish up and conclude with everybody by giving you an overview of the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild of Michigan. Facebook group is open to everybody. It is an open forum. You don't have to be a member of the club to participate in that forum. We also have the Facebook group for the Michigan treatment-free beekeepers. It was a little bit of a different posting and conversation policy between the two groups, but the reason for that is clear and laid out in those policies on those particular venues. We want to remind you about some of the efforts that we're hoping to aim for with our queen breeding and nuke exchange program for beekeepers. We want to be able to establish a network and a co-op of beekeepers that are practicing a lot of the things that you're hearing and experiencing today, so that others can benefit from the genetics in the region and also improving the genetics in your region. I like to say I'm not an altruistic beekeeper. I want you to have better bees so that your better bees are helping my bees be better also. I probably will never say that the same way twice. We are also working on a mentor group network development. We want other beekeepers to have access to mentors who are providing treatment-free and chemical-free practices. And it's not just the chemical-free, treatment-free aspect of beekeeping, but you're learning basic hive management. You're learning what you need to do when it comes to splitting. You're learning about bee biology, and you're getting hands-on frame time. And then Terry had mentioned that we're discussing how to create a hive or badge program for beginners. We want you guys to be able to earn a hive. The Bee Guild has a plan for you to complete these processes, and at the end of this period of apprenticeship, you not only get the badge of honor of having had completed that, but we'll provide you with your first nuke. We'll give you your first set of bees, and we'll give you some good bees. All right. We also want to encourage you to reach out to us. Send me an email, send me a text, whatever you need to do. Stop by the webpage for the Guild, shoot us future speaker and topic recommendations. And the last thing I wanted to cover is that we're working on a forum for individuals to come together and share, other than the Facebook venue, not that that's not sufficient, but a sustainable beekeeping guild, where people can come together and they can express their views and opinions, and they can share like-mindedness in these efforts without having to face the barrels of some of the more mainline forums where you can easily get distracted or even harshly treated for just having the idea or notion that it's possible the bee could take care of itself and its genetics. We want to be able to give people that place and venue to learn from each other on a consistent basis. We don't have to just wait for conferences and meetings to get that information. You can go right online, go into that forum and share that info with each other and have access to each other. With that, I thank you all so much for those who have stopped by. I thank you all so much for hanging in there with me, and to the last 20 or so participants that are just there by a thread. Have a good night. Enjoy your spring, and we'll be talking to you soon. Good night.